Nate back here with you, High Noon Leatherworks, for another leather adventure. And today we're going to continue the hunting knife sheath with the spacer that has the dragon scales on it. And I'm going to pull you in here a little closer, and we're going to use the stitching horse today. And that'll be the next step in this process. So come on in and let's get started. Alright, so I've got my sheath, the two pieces, the front and the back, with the spacer in my stitching horse. I've got it clamped down really tight so it can't slide around on me. I've used a couple of pieces of scrap leather, one on each side of the sheath, so I don't smash or scar anything with my stitching horse. Then I cut a piece of black synthetic sinew, and I went the distance all the way around the sheath where I have my holes drilled for my stitching, and I measured the length of my sinew. Then I times that by 4, so I want it 4 times that length, and then I add just a little bit more to it just because I've got that spacer in there, and that spacer is going to take up some more sinew. So you notice I have a pretty long thread, but what I do is when I have, like with a holster or anything that I'm stitching by hand, if I have a long thread, I pull some of my thread through the needle pretty far on both ends, and I make them even, and then that way as I go, when I get closer to the end of my stitching, I can just keep pulling my thread out of my needle, and then when I get down to the end I don't have much hanging out at all. So that's how I deal with that. What I've done is I've put my first needle through the first hole at the top of the sheath and ran it through and made sure that my needles are even. So I pull my needles out, make sure that my thread's even. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back through and find that second hole and put my needle in from front to back. And because of how thick this is, you may need, I use this very small pair of needle nose, but they're tiny. And I can grab a hold of the sheath and then grab a hold of my needle with the needle nose and just pull it right through. So as I pull that through the second hole, I'll pull it fairly snug, but I don't want to try to pull it tight because it pulls my other needle through, because I don't have a locked stitch yet. I'll pull that down, that thread, and then I'll take my second needle, and this is called saddle stitching. I'll take my second needle and I'll go right back through that same hole, but instead of going back to front or front to back, I go back to front. So I'm taking it through the back side and pulling it through to the front side. Now that's going to be my first locking stitch. So by locking, that means I could take both threads, one on each side, and pull on it real snug, and that'll lock that stitch in, because this is waxed synthetic sinew. Now what I like to do is, since there's going to be a lot of tension on this being the first stitch up here where the knife goes in and out, I'll come back to the first hole, go through it again. Now it's going to be a little tighter now because there's some thread in that hole. but I'll pull that through. Again, the first hole. So I'm going front to back. I can pull on it now a little harder because I've got a locked stitch in there. Take my second needle and I'm going to go into my second hole. Or I'm sorry, my first hole again. The one I just pulled that one through. But I'm going back to front, and then I can pull that needle through. Now, the more times you pull that through, the more thicknesses of thread you have in there, the harder it's going to be to get it through that hole. So I can go ahead and pull on those again real snug, and that locks that in twice now. So now I've got two stitches in that same area, and what that does is that's going to really lock that in, make it super strong. It's not going to come apart. So I'll go into my second hole again and come back through that one, front to back. Again, it's going to be a little snug because already have two thicknesses of thread through there. But pull it on through and snug it. And that double stitch is going to make the beginning of this stitching task, or this project. It's going to make it super strong. And then I'll go from back to front again, following that same second hole. I have to make sure I get the right thread. And again, the more times you do this, the thicker that thread gets in that hole, so it does make it a little more difficult to get it through there. So I'm having to use my needle nose to push that You want to be careful not to split your thread too. That could weaken your stitch. Let's see if I can guide that. And here's what we'll do. Since it's having a hard time going through from back to front, I'll go from front to back again with my other needle and just let it, you can see I just let it hang out. And then what I can do is, as I pull that needle out, I'll just follow that needle with my back to front needle. And there it just popped in. So it guided that needle right into that hole. And sometimes that just happens, especially with a spacer or something, when you have three thicknesses that you're going through. Um, and especially when you're doing a double stitch at the beginning like that, because you've got so much thread thickness in there. Alright, I'll lock that in good and tight. Then I'll go to the next hole down, take my front to back, and go through. I'm going to pull this, unlock this for a second. Pull that up a little bit, make it more even for the front and the back to be together. It wants to move down a little bit as I tighten that stitching horse. Alright, so let's go front through to the back. You notice when I use those needle nose, I'm not grabbing a hold of the needle and yanking on it. I grab a hold of the needle with the pliers. Now I'm taking my other needle and going from back through to the front, grabbing a hold of the needle with the pliers and then pushing on the pliers with my finger. And then that way I'm not stressing my needle so much or taking a chance of bending it. Lock that one in. Then I'll go through front to back to the next thread. And again, I'm grabbing it with the pliers and then pushing the needle nose, not yanking on the needle. Go from front to back, take my other needle and go through the same hole, back to front. And you'll notice how much easier that is now that I don't have 4 thicknesses of thread in that hole. It's going through pretty easily now. And then lock that thread in. So I'll continue that front to back, take the needle that's on that side and go back to front. And then once you get going past that first initial stitch and you do your double stitch, you lock it in, then you get on a roll and you just keep on trucking. So I'm gonna stitch this all the way around. When I get back to the other side to finish up about the last 2 or 3 stitches, I'll come back and I'll explain what I'm doing there. So at this point, the saddle stitching, I'm just working my way down the sheath and doing front to back, back to front, basic saddle stitching. And I'll do that all the way until I get around to the other end, and then I'll finish it off. So I'm just going to keep on going, and then I'll come back and I'll show you when I get down to these last 3 or 4 stitches. Alright, so now I'm down to the last 4 holes. I've went from here all the way around to this end. So I'm down to the end here. Again, I'm still doing the hand saddle stitching. It took approximately 30 minutes to do all that, and I'll show you how I'll finish this up. I'm still going front to back, back to front, so I'm going through the front here, pulling my needle through, taking my second needle, going from the back side through to the front side, pulling that needle and thread through, and then I lock each one of those stitches in good and tight. Then again, I just keep repeating. I go from front to back, pull that needle through, go back to front through the same hole. Both needles always go through the same hole, and then you lock it in. And then this is the last hole. So what I'll do is I'll go through front to back, and then back to front on this last hole. Lock it in. Then I'll go back a hole. So I'll go back to the second hole, and again it's going to be tighter because I've already got 2 thicknesses of thread through that hole. But I'll just have to use my needle nose and pull that thread through there, and then I take my second needle on the back side and I'll go through that same hole again, but I'll go from back to front. And now I've got 3 thicknesses of thread in there, so I'm really going to have to help push that needle through there. And then once I get my second needle pushed through, I can go ahead and lock, pull both of them. Now I'm still in the second hole back. So here I have a first hole, or the end hole. I'm going to push that needle through that hole again, and I can kind of pull that second thickness back, and I can see the tip of my needle coming through where I pull this one back just a little bit, and I can slide that needle. I'm not going through the back. I slid that needle out between those 2 pieces of leather and go ahead and pull that through and pull it tight. Take my needle on the back side, go through my last hole. Again, the same thing. I'm not going to come out the front. I'm going to come out over here in between those 2 pieces of leather. And what that does is that allows me to hide my final knot between those 2 pieces of leather. So I can pull that good and tight, and then I can go ahead and tie my knot, and it sinks down between those 2 pieces of leather. So it's hidden. There's nobody that's going to see that knot, because it's not going to be on the front, it's not going to be on the back. It's down in between there. Now what I can do is take my sheath out of my stitching horse, and let me bring you back over to the workbench, and I'll show you how I finish these up. Alright, so maybe you can see this a little bit better now. I can get it up, but this final stitch here is in between those two pieces of leather. So I don't know how good that's showing up on camera. It's hard to get a real good close-up. Yeah, you can see it right there. So what I'll do is, after I tie a good granny knot in there and pull it real good and tight, I'll pull both of those pieces up, cut them off really short, so you can see just barely there's some sticking out of there. And then I'll take my lighter, and I like to use, on the stylus, I got a little flat, little spoon type, and you can use just about anything that's flat. And I'll take my lighter and I'll light it, and then I'll run that over that, and it'll melt because it's got that wax on it. And I'll kind of push that down. Then I'll take my mallet and I flatten that out. And once you flatten that out, that becomes hidden, so you don't end up with any knots on this side, on the back, or the front. So it makes a nice finished look. And there's a real good shot of those dragon scales on the front and on the back. Alright, I want to thank you for coming along today, checking out this episode of the dragon scale knife sheath, and threw in a couple of different tips that I haven't used before, as far as stitching and how to hide those knots. So please, as I always say, like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.